Hello, everybody. Welcome to our daily class with our Alexander Muss High School and Israel teachers. This is a joint program between Jewish National Fund and Alexander Muss High School in Israel, where we come together virtually to learn with our amazing Muss teachers. Today, once again, we'll be learning from Danny Stein. Danny grew up in the great city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and attended the Jack M. Barrack Hebrew Academy, formerly Akiba Hebrew Academy, from middle school and high school. In 11th grade, he came to AMHSI with a class for 4 months. It was then that Danny's tenure began with Muss. After graduating from the University of Maryland with a BA in history and a BA in psychology and spending time in different corners of the world, Danny returned to Israel as a counselor at AMHSI. It was there that he met his wife, Chana, who was his co-counselor. After a year at Yeshivat HaMiftar in Efrat, Danny came back to Muss in 2008 for the third time, this time, thank God, as an educator. Danny and Chana lived on campus, where he was also the director of dormitory life and spirituality. Today, they live in Moshav Mevo Modim, easy for me to say, and are proud parents of Adva, Neve Chaim, and your baby girl's name is?
Oria and Liam, 2 more.
Oria and Liam, there's 2 more, so this bio is a little old. But just before we, before we get started today, Danny will be teaching us, Danny will be teaching us how the Eichmann trial changed the Jewish people after the Shoah. I just got to ask Danny, I know it's been a long time since you lived in Philadelphia. It was nice to have your dad visit a couple of Shabbatot to go on his sivuv, on his neighborhood walk. But you've remained a Philadelphia sports fan, right, Danny?
No doubt, no doubt.
Still fly, Eagles fly?
Every Sunday during the season, absolutely.
That's good. That's great to hear. Well, anyway,
Draft's coming up in a couple days.
What was that? The draft is coming up in a couple of days. Hopefully it'll be a good one for the Eagles. Anyway, without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn our classroom over to Danny.
Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see everybody, especially my former students, especially you guys and my family. Not you know them, but it's okay. No, I'm just kidding. Guys, great to see you, seriously. I wanted to speak about something that I feel really passionate about. And today, Yom HaShoah in Israel has already started. The sun went down about an hour ago. So now it's Yom HaShoah in Israel. In a few more hours for you guys, it'll become Yom HaShoah. And it's interesting because I'm right now in the middle of my Shoah class. We're doing online, distance learning with my Milken students who had to leave midway through this past session. And we're just in the middle of teaching this right now. So the timing is really perfect and something that I really want to teach about in this forum. So I actually asked to switch into this time slot so I could speak on Yom HaShoah as well. And what I want to speak about is what happened after the Shoah. I don't know how many people learn in school a lot about how the Shoah, the technicalities and on martial living and this and that. We go to the places and you see what happened. But I think there's sometimes a misconception that when the Shoah was over, it was over. And that's really not true. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, and how these open wounds, which were open for years after the Shoah, finally began to heal. And so essentially what I guess we need to know is, first of all, like I said, I'm not going to show any horrific pictures, but most of the horrific pictures that we've seen from the Shoah were taken after liberation. They weren't taken by Nazis who were taking pictures in the camps, but those pictures of death camp inmates that looked emaciated that we've all seen, those were taken after liberation. And you don't heal from that overnight. And essentially what happened after the immediate aftermath of liberation for the Jewish people was that approximately, of course the numbers are approximate here, but at least 60,000 Holocaust victims died after liberation, after the United States and Soviet armies had already liberated the camps, but people who were simply too sick, too starving, and too unhealthy to recover. So you have, of the 6 million that we speak about, 60,000 of them at least were killed or died after liberation. And you have a situation where you had, it's all a famous story, but you have army units liberating camps, seeing starving people, and wanting to help them as fast, in any way they possibly can. Of course, you see somebody that's starving, the first thing you want to do is give them food. And I think any large amount of food might have overwhelmed these people, but these people were given, in many cases, army rations. Army rations is concentrated food. and that their systems had no chance. And in many cases, you had the American army was feeding people food that led directly to them succumbing to their deaths because it would simply overwhelm their systems. And this is going to happen in the weeks after liberation all over the place. And then you have approximately, again, the numbers are hard here, but approximately 250,000 people who were liberated and survived. And so what happens to these people? So I want us to put ourselves in the mindset for a few minutes of a Holocaust survivor, someone who's just survived the Shoah. And there's really a couple major things on your mind. And I'll speak about, I think, the most important two. The first one, which I think is probably the most obvious one, is, well, where's my family? Right? These people lived in a time where there was no communication easily. We didn't, not like this, we can't do what we're doing now or anything like it. It didn't even have fax machines, you can imagine. They had nothing. And so they had no idea, people had no idea which members of their family were alive or dead. People had no idea if their own wives and husbands and children and mothers and fathers were alive or dead. So I think the number one thing, they were finally liberated from the camps, and they finally realized they weren't going to die, was I need to find my family. And I think the second major thing that people are thinking about at this point is justice. What is going to happen to the horrible Nazi bastards who did this to us? And so I'll talk about each one for a few minutes. When it comes to finding your family, what happened was, so people eventually are going to, well, it's interesting. You didn't leave the camps right away because there was no place to go. So famously, you have a situation where the American army is going to find a concentration camp, find a bunch of, hundreds of completely emaciated, starving Jews, and these people are finally free to go until the American army tells them that they're no longer free to go, and that they were trying to do this in a relatively gentle way, but they basically said, we cannot have hundreds of thousands of starving people, starving sick people now wandering across Europe trying to get who knows where, and essentially they're going to be kept in the camps for weeks. So even though you're free to go, you're not free to go at all, actually. The Holocaust is over, but they were stuck in the camps. Finally, eventually, the camps will be open, and people will try to go home. The best way to find your family is to go home. That was not easy. These people had no money. There was no international fund set up to help the Holocaust survivors find their way home or to help them reclaim their property or anything like this. And so what you're going to have is basically someone who's just been through the Holocaust, who's just been through more than 5 years of horrific, victimization and all kinds of terrible things we don't need to go into right now. And now they have to basically beg, in many cases, beg on the streets or get some weird job, try to make a little bit of money so they can, in many cases, you're crossing borders. Not always, but you have to cross borders. You have to pay for the train fare or the bus fare, or you're gonna have to stow away on trains. Something that it adds to the humiliation you've already been through. But essentially, you're gonna finally get back to your town. And I'm just gonna relate stories that have been told to us here at MUS from various Holocaust survivors. But I think people have heard these stories before, but basically, you get back to your town and everyone, all of your non-Jewish neighbors are staring at you. As you walk towards your home, people are just staring at you like you're a ghost because they expected you and everyone like you to be dead. And all of a sudden you've shown up out of nowhere and people are just looking at you, shocked. And these are all true stories, but people are staring. As people walk by, one of the Holocaust survivors that we spoke to once told us that she noticed someone walk by her wearing a familiar dress. And she's thinking to herself, don't I know that dress? Isn't that my mother's dress? It turns out it was, by the way. Somebody was wearing her mother's dress. It wasn't her mom. It had been taken out of her home. Eventually, one eventually goes to your home, the home that you own, in theory. You get there, and one might expect that the home is like, no one's lived in it for the last 6 years, so it's going to be like boarded up and overgrown with weeds and all kinds of stuff. But no, it's going to be well kept with a mowed lawn or a fresh paint job or whatever it might be. Someone's clearly been keeping this place up for you. So maybe your first reaction might be, oh my God, thank God my family's there. And you go to your home and you have to, again, it's a home that you own. Imagine buying this house. And then you have to knock on the door of your own home or ring the bell. And who opens the door? It's already a weird experience to ring the bell of your own home and not having a clue who might open the door. And who opens the door? Not your husband or wife or your mother or father, but some strange Polish couple. Maybe they were your neighbor from before. Maybe you've never seen them before. Some Polish couple that has essentially taken your home. And the best case scenario, right? And a weird interaction is going to take place. Who are you? Well, what do you mean, who am I? Who are you? This is my home. This is not your home. This is our home. Who are you? This is our home. And the best case scenario, the door is slammed in your face. In the worst case scenario, you'll be murdered on your own doorstep after surviving the Holocaust. And this will happen all throughout Europe, especially Poland, where people will get back to their homes and be killed by the people who stole their homes. One of my colleagues, Benji, tells a story of his grandfather who went to his apartment, and as he's going up the stairs, the neighbor just happened to walk outside and see him there and says, just so you know, there's someone living there now with a crowbar behind the door. He's waiting for you to come home, just so you know, with a crowbar. And Benji's grandfather had to then at that point decide, do I knock on the door or not? I actually don't remember what he did. I think he just left his home. So where did people go then? Where did people go? They end up gathering in various places. And one of these places is a place called Kielce. And there's communities essentially of Holocaust survivors that gathered together. And in 1946, so you're talking about less than a year after the Holocaust, there was a blood libel charge. The Jews of Kielce, the Holocaust survivors, were accused of using blood, Christian blood in matzah. A pogrom happened, and 42 Holocaust survivors were murdered in a pogrom in Kielce in 1946, less than a year after the Holocaust. And if that didn't get the message across that these countries didn't want you back, then, I mean, that was basically it, especially in Poland, all these people. Basically, people just concluded, well, I guess Poland is nothing but a graveyard and people that hate me. And generally, that was the last straw for Holocaust survivors. They couldn't go home. They couldn't go anywhere else either. So where did they go? They ended up, what ends up being for years, and they had no place to go. They were essentially what were called displaced persons. So they ended up back now in DP camps, or displaced persons camps. But these camps, I don't know if people know this, but they were the very same camps, in many cases, that served as concentration camps in World War II because they were already built. And so imagine being a Holocaust survivor. You're trying to find your family. That's not happening. Your home has been stolen. And now you end up back in a concentration camp. And that was the reality for many, many, many Holocaust survivors in the months after they survived the Holocaust. Now, what about justice? That's also not going to be a very happy story, right? So I'm going to read some numbers off for a second. But basically, after the war, the Allies got together and put out a statement that said, we will find the perpetrators of this horrific genocide and bring them to justice. And they eventually, I'm just going to get these numbers here. They eventually decided that they're going to put Nazis on trial. And there was a glimmer of hope for these Holocaust survivors who wanted to see justice done to the people who had victimized them for the last 5 years. Really even more if you think about the time before the Holocaust. So let's listen to these numbers because they're pretty shocking, okay? You have, we've all heard the Nuremberg Trials. So just as a prelude though, so we know what's going on here, they decided that there were approximately, of all the Nazi soldiers, right? Not every Nazi soldier is a war criminal, right? If you were a fighter pilot, that doesn't mean you necessarily were involved in the final solution, but 13 million Nazis were implicated in war crimes, 13 million, okay? Now you obviously can't put 13 million people on trial. That's just, I mean, how is that even logistically possible? So they decided, that those are all the war criminals, they decided to whittle that down to the number 3,445,000, and that's the people who had significant criminal complicity. The high-ranking Nazis, that's 3.5 million. Well, you really can't put 3.5 million people on trial either, think about it. So then they decided, we're only going to get the worst of the worst. So 480,000 of these people had direct participation in genocide. And of those 480,000 in the Nuremberg trials, they tried 24 people. Of the 480,000 of the original 13 million. Of those 24 people in the Nuremberg trials, 12 were executed, the others weren't. And over the next, how long has it been? 70 years? Over the next 70 years, we can count something like, I don't know if anyone has a real number, but a couple hundred more Nazis, the neighborhood of 200 to 300 more Nazis have been put on trial. And that means that the vast majority of the 13 million out of 13 million war criminals, of whom 500,000, 480,000, were the worst of the worst, the only people that have ever been even put on trial is about somewhere between 200 and 300. There's an incredible documentary by Cloud Landsman called Shoah. It's 9 hours long, and I recommend it's all on YouTube. Start watching it on this Yom HaShoah. One of the striking examples of this takes place in that movie, where one of the commanders of Treblinka was caught and put on trial and found guilty of accessory to murder in about 400,000 cases. He was found guilty of accessory to murder for 400,000 people. A guy named Oberhauser. He was given 4 years in prison, and of those 4 years in prison for that crime, he served 2. So the idea of like finding your family becomes absolutely, I mean, generally, we all know 9 out of 10 people didn't find any family members. And justice became a big joke. It wasn't, look, the Nuremberg Trials had a great idea, but what's gonna happen eventually is they're gonna have the original trials, and then what's gonna happen after that is basically two things. One, the soldiers who had seen the camps and smelled the camps and had been there in those moments, they wanted to go home finally. And so when they leave and new people come who didn't have that same passion for justice, who didn't see what they saw, they simply, it just fizzled out. Combine that with the fact that, you know, an Iron Curtain fell on Russia and you had, it fell in Europe, and they had to deal with all of a sudden communism, and West Germany was all of a sudden an important ally. And basically, many millions of Nazis, for those reasons, were basically just given a pardon. And the only ones that have ever been, like I said, tried and brought to justice, we're talking in the low hundreds. So what happens? Even though you don't have your family, and even though you don't have justice, people still can't just live, you know, broken lives forever. And so they're going to be basically gathered together in DP camps. I just want to share a couple images here. First of all, I meant to show you this before, but this is an image. Wait a minute, I think I'm not sharing the screen. Yes, I am. Let me go back. Sorry about that. But this is an image from the aftermath of the Kielce pogrom. This is a famous picture colorized from the Nuremberg Trials. 24 Nazis on trial surrounded by various soldiers. But in the DP camps, I want to mention that people didn't want to like completely live totally broken lives. And what's going to happen in these DP camps all over the place is people will meet, right? You haven't found your family. You don't have, you're in a DP camp, men, women who in theory have lost everything and don't know, really don't have any way to find out who they haven't lost. Men and women, Jewish men and women are going to meet. They're going to be engaged the next day. They're going to have a wedding 2 days later, and they're going to be pregnant with their first baby 3 weeks or 4 weeks after that. And in these DP camps all across Europe, you're going to have hundreds and thousands of Jewish weddings, like this one, or this one. These are outdoor weddings happening in the DP camps, and babies being born like crazy, right? You had this huge Jewish, there must be, when you've been surrounded by death for 5 years, there must be this instinct when it's all over to create life. And you're gonna have hundreds of weddings and thousands of babies being born all over in these DP camps, while people are still basically sitting in these camps that they sat in during the Shoah. But eventually, and they were asked, by the way, people asked, where do you want to go? You can't stay in these DP camps forever. And initially, in the late 40s, people said, generally, they said, let us finally go home. Let us go to Israel. Well, wait, you can't go to Israel. Why can't you go to Israel? Because even after the Holocaust, the British, who were in control of Israel, would still severely restrict immigration, as they had been doing during the Holocaust and before the Holocaust, but they're going to keep it up after the Holocaust as well. Here, we just had somebody chat. Well, one of my students' parents actually, it looks like, whose grandparents, whose parents were born, or grandparents, excuse me, were married in Bergen-Belsen. And that's not that uncommon, right? A marriage in Bergen-Belsen, think about it. So people asked, where do you want to go? And Israel, let's go to Israel. Well, no, the British still won't let you in. It's pretty insane if you think about that. That the British had been restricting Jewish immigration to Israel during the Holocaust, thus indirectly contributing to the fact that 6 million Jews died. And then when it was all over, they kept restricting Jewish immigration. So you can't go there. What about the United States of America? Option number 1 or 2 on most people's list. So in the late 40s, you still had immigration quotas, and you still really couldn't go to America either. People in many cases wrote their third option on like the card that they were given. You know what? Forget it. You're not letting me go to Israel? Crematorium. Send me there. And it's crazy that they said that after the Holocaust, but it was enough was enough. Enough is enough already. Eventually, 1948, Israel will be declared. The DP camps will empty. Many, many, many 100,000 Holocaust survivors will finally enter Israel, only in 1948. They were stuck in the DP camps for the previous 3 years. In the late 40s, early 50s, the American government will also relax immigration quotas for Holocaust refugees. People move to America. By the way, just as an aside, Nazis also moved to America. And we can talk about that. I won't talk too much about it, but all you had to do was sign a piece of paper that said I was not a Nazi. And the American government, for various reasons, more or less turned a blind eye in most cases. There have been a few people that have been caught and deported, but generally, Nazis as well went to the United States of America. And finally, the Holocaust survivors can move on. So we had this idea that the Holocaust ends with the Holocaust. Well, that's not true. You don't find your family. There's no justice happening at all, or not much of it. And then you're stuck in a concentration camp, DP camp, for 3 to 5 years. Eventually, people left. And how does your life then take shape? So the Holocaust survivors that we spoke to, there's crazy stories. I'll just give you one of them. But a woman that used to speak to us, she gets to America. She hunts down her only living relative, someone who was not in the war, who got to America before the war. It's her cousin, I think. And she finds her, and she immediately she starts, it's her only person that shares her DNA in the world is still alive, and she starts just crying and pouring out her heart and saying everything that happened in her horrible, horrible experience. And this woman who was not in the war doesn't know how to respond. Obviously, how do you respond? And her response is, "That sounds really terrible. What did you guys use for toilet paper in the camps?" That was the first question she was asked. And she said, "Did you know it was really bad here in the United States too? We had to ration butter at various times throughout the war." And this woman who had just been through the Holocaust here, and she basically realized that, you know what, I'm just not going to say anything because no one has a clue what they're talking about or what I'm talking about. And basically, Holocaust survivors in the United States of America learned to just shut up. They learned to stop talking because nobody could hear them. Nobody could deal with what they had to say. And they stopped talking. And if anybody here knows anything about psychology and trauma, you're not supposed to keep it inside. You're not supposed to stop talking. And that's going to lead to basically a generation of Holocaust survivors who had really, really, really problematic psychological issues. I mean, I'll just give you one, there's a lot of examples, but you're talking about, overprotective Jewish parents. So people always laugh about overprotective Jewish parents, that they're so funny and cute and say, oh, Jews are so protective, except that when you realize, all of us have like the Jewish grandmother who always wants us to eat more and like, eat more, come on, more, eat more, and come on. And it's really, cute until you realize that it's also a little bit because the Jewish people have an issue. We don't know when we're not going to get to eat next, somewhere deep inside us. It's 75 degrees, put on like 3 sweatshirts, your curfew is like 6 p.m. because if you don't, I'm going to freak out. And you have a generation of super overprotective parents. I mean, I'll give you another example from our school. But Chaim Fishman, the former head of our school, he was born in a DP camp. He was, as far as I remember, he was the first child born to his parents' circle of friends. They all moved to New York eventually. And he was the oldest child in this group of Holocaust survivors. And he remembers growing up and having this unbelievable, spoiled upbringing of like, whenever he did anything important at all, first day of first grade, like 10 families came over to spoil him and give him gifts and go crazy. And he had no idea why you had these these 10 couples who were constantly like fawning over him and talking about, oh, he did this, oh, he did that. And only later in life did he realize that he was basically the symbol for these people of the fact that they were still alive. He was the first child that basically showed them that they had lived through it and that they were essentially continuing their family's lines. But it took him many, many, many years of having a weird upbringing to realize that. In these Holocaust survivors in the United States of America, you have a situation where it's bring your grandparent to school day. That's the thing. We have that in Israel sometimes too. And what do you do when you're a Holocaust survivor and your child comes home and says, "Wait, tomorrow's is bring grandma to school day, but why don't I have a grandma? All my friends have a grandma. Why don't I have a grandma?" And you've never spoken about this. What are you supposed to explain to your 9-year-old why they don't have grandma? Because the worst thing in the history of mankind happened to your family? No, you're not going to explain that to her. In fact, you're so traumatized, what's going to happen is you're probably just going to go in your room, have some crazy flashbacks, cry yourself to sleep, and maybe you'll see your child the next morning. Who knows? Right? Or, "Dad, why do you have a tattoo on your arm? That's kind of a weird tattoo." And again, he goes in the room, closes the door, has some kind of breakdown. And this is going to happen, and this is going to lead guys to difficult relationships between parents and children. Their children have been affected by this. There's even a study that came out a year or two ago that spoke about the fact that this trauma can be seen in Jewish people's DNA. I don't know the article. I was going to show it to you guys, but I couldn't find it. But if you Google that, it was in Times of Israel a couple of years ago that this trauma is literally, you can see the effects of it in our DNA. That was in America. What about Israel? In Israel, you had a slightly different problem. In Israel, I think there was a similar problem of Holocaust survivors. There wasn't like Yom HaShoah where Holocaust survivors were like it is happening right now, where Holocaust survivors are invited into people's living rooms. This year, of course, it's virtual. But to speak about their experience, no, in many cases, it was not like that at all. You had a dynamic in Israel where you had like the weak Holocaust survivors that went like sheep to the slaughter, and you had the strong Israelis who had been draining the swamps and building the country and fighting off 5 Arab armies and winning the War of Independence. And the dynamic basically was like, you Holocaust survivors, you should consider yourselves lucky that we were tough enough to build this country while you guys were basically getting slaughtered in Europe. And it was a really unhealthy dynamic. And Holocaust survivors were not made to feel good, and nobody wanted to hear from them in Israel. And so you basically have a situation where after the Holocaust, you have Holocaust survivors in both Israel and the US basically keeping their mouths totally shut and causing more and more and more post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is not a very rosy picture of life for the Holocaust survivors after the Holocaust. So how does this begin to change? It really begins to change with a famous event that happened in 1960 and eventually 61. And it goes back to, well, before I get to that, actually, let me say one quick thing, which I didn't mention. In terms of the justice, by the way, it's a pretty fascinating part of the story, which I just forgot to mention. So there's no justice happening, right? The Nuremberg Trials, 24 Nazis out of 13 million, not a whole lot. And so you actually had groups of Jews that formed to try to hunt down Nazis and kill them. So one was actually called the Avengers, Hanokmim in Hebrew. There's a few others, but we actually had a teacher at our school, one of the people that trained myself and other people at the school named David Sprung, who didn't work directly for these organizations, but he worked kind of indirectly with them. And David Sprung was I don't know how much what we're supposed to talk about this, but I think it's worth mentioning that he certainly hunted down Nazis, and he and his friends would eventually track them, find them wherever they were, mostly in South America, enter their apartments, wait for them, tie them up, and tell these Nazis, in the name of the Jewish people, we condemn you to hell, and execute them. And this happened to certain, there were certain Nazis that met justice that way. But again, we're talking about a handful. So again, we have a generation of Holocaust survivors who are completely, I don't know what the word is, but psychologically affected long-term, to put it mildly. And how does this begin to change, guys? It begins to change in 1960. What happens? What happened to all these Nazis? Where'd they all go? Okay? Some of them, like I said, ended up in the US, right? They could lie in their immigration paperwork. Most of them are going to escape through Russia. Eventually they'll get to the Pacific Ocean. There was something called that ended up being nicknamed the Rat Line, which was a strange story, but it was a network of like monasteries and churches that would help Nazis escape because they didn't believe in capital punishment, and the idea that, again, I can't understand this one. I really can't. Maybe someone else can explain it to me one day. But the idea in Catholicism that people aren't exactly responsible for sin, but sin itself is the problem, and therefore people should be forgiven even for the worst crimes and things like that. So in fact, there were Catholics that helped Nazis get away and helped them escape capture and eventually get to places that didn't mind housing them and keeping them mostly in South America. So you have a ton of Nazis basically hiding out in South America. Some of the highest ranking Nazis, of course, like, Hitler and Goebbels, they committed suicide. Others had been tried in the Nuremberg Trials. Many of them got away. And one of the biggest open wounds in terms of Nazis that got away was a guy named Adolf Eichmann. At this point, I think we've all heard of him. Adolf Eichmann was essentially the guy most responsible in many ways for the final solution. He was responsible for the transport of the Jews to their deaths. So he was the one who organized the entire final solution. He's the one who essentially single-handedly made it so that in the last months of the war, the Nazis could, with their last gasps before they lost the war, make sure to exterminate essentially all the Jews of Hungary. 500,000 people in just a couple months in Auschwitz. And there's other things that, there was a fellow Nazi who said about Adolf Eichmann, of all the people that I know that personified satanic principles, he's number one. And this was a big open wound because Eichmann he actually had been caught in the beginning. He was caught, he just lied about who he was, he then got away. And there was a big gaping wound for these Holocaust survivors. Where's Adolf Eichmann? Most of the highest ranking Nazis had either died or been killed or tried or whatever it was. And no one knew where this guy was. In the 1960s, Israel's Mossad was engaged in Nazi hunting. And eventually they get a tip. What happened to Eichmann? What happened to Eichmann was he ended up settling in Argentina. He got plastic surgery so he could look a little bit different. He changed his name, but he didn't honestly go crazy in terms of hiding. And his wife, for example, Eichmann's wife mourned her dead husband, who apparently had died, not really, of course, moved to Argentina, married this guy whose name is Ricardo Clement, and they were living together, Eichmann's wife, widow, and this other guy. And so it wasn't that hard to realize that this guy might have been Eichmann. And so in the 1960s, there's a tip, Eichmann's wife, living in Argentina, go check this out and see if this is really him. And so the Mossad sends a team down there. Of course, a movie just came out about this recently. I actually haven't seen it yet. I heard it's not all that awesome, but if you've seen it, maybe I can be corrected. But it's great that the movie came out and told the story, Operation Finale. But the Mossad tracks him down. They start observing him, okay? And he's clearly, his name really isn't Ricardo Clement. He's obviously German. That doesn't prove that he's Eichmann, but he's a German guy. He's married to Eichmann's wife. They start observing him. There's all kinds of circumstantial evidence that happens. One of the interesting examples of how they caught him was that every day he had a very, habitual, I go to work, I come home on the same bus, I have dinner, I go to sleep. And one day he gets off his bus a stop early, bought flowers, comes home, and he and his wife had a celebratory dinner. So what are they celebrating? What's going on? So the Mossad's opening their books and seeing, is it his birthday? Is it her birthday maybe for the flowers? It wasn't her birthday. Is it their wedding anniversary? It wasn't that either. It was the wedding anniversary of Adolf Eichmann and his wife. They were celebrating their real wedding anniversary. And that was one of the things that confirmed for the Mossad, this is really him. Once they decided it was him beyond a shadow of a doubt, they decided they had to get him out. Problem is, and he's living in Argentina, that means a number of things. Argentina's not going to allow a foreign spy agency to operate on their soil. They're not going to extradite Nazis. We in Israel did not have diplomatic relations with Argentina anyway. So you can't simply say, we're going to take him. They had to sneak him out. And so a couple days later, after confirming that it was him, there was a car that was being fixed on the side of the road. Eichmann walks by. He gets bashed on the head. They throw him in the car. They drive to a safe house. He opens his eyes and pretty immediately says, you must be the Israelis. I'm Adolf Eichmann. At that point, we knew for sure that we had the right guy, but we had to get him out. That year, luckily, was Argentina's, I think it was 120, it was some anniversary of their independence. Israel sent a plane full of performers for the big parade, and they had all these performers, and they were in Argentina for about a week. But during this week of festivities, one of the performers, whatever, gymnast or whatever, had a horrific car accident and had to be bandaged from head to toe. And so as the plane is getting ready to take off, there was one of these performers who was wheeled in a complete body cast from head to toe, wheeled onto the plane. And of course, that was Adolf Eichmann. The plane took off with Eichmann, and finally, it was confirmed. They radioed back to David Ben-Gurion, who called a special session of the Knesset and said the famous words, Adolf Eichmann is in our hands. And what are we going to do with him? Obviously, he deserves to get executed. I think most people would agree with that. But Ben-Gurion said it's not going to be that simple. We're not going to do what he did and just execute him. We're going to give him a trial. We're going to give him a defense attorney. He's going to have to be proven guilty, just like anybody else would. And if he's proven guilty, then he'll serve his sentence. They bring him to Israel, and the trial of Adolf Eichmann begins. And the Israeli government realizes this is not going to be all about Eichmann. This is really going to be about the Holocaust itself. And Eichmann is brought, I mean, you can watch actually the trial on YouTube. Most of it, maybe even all of it, is on YouTube. There's some pretty compelling parts. I'm just going to quickly show just one picture from it. But the trial begins, guys, in 1960. This is Adolf Eichmann, who was tried throughout the entire trial behind bulletproof glass, guarded by two Israelis, both of whom, I don't know if anybody can tell, but neither of these Jews are obviously Ashkenazi. They weren't. These were Mizrahi Jews. The reason being that basically every single European Israeli would have a hard time not murdering him on the spot. So he was behind bulletproof glass, guarded by people, to make sure that his entire trial could take place. I'm going to read quickly the opening statement of the prosecutor. It's pretty amazing. His name was Gidon Hausner. And he said the following. He says, "As I stand before you, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone, but with me in this place and at this hour stand 6 million accusers. But they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards the man who sits in the glass dock and cry, 'I accuse.' For their ashes were piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and in the fields of Treblinka, or washed away by the rivers of Poland, and their graves are scattered over the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voices are not heard. Therefore, it falls on me to be their spokesman and to unfold in their name this indictment." And they charge Eichmann initially with high crimes against the Jewish people. They will then change that to crimes against humanity, because it wasn't only about Jews what happened in the Holocaust. And of course, Eichmann's defense, for any of us that have ever learned about the Nuremberg Trials, Eichmann's defense was basically that I was just following orders, which is what essentially all the Nazis said. And witness after witness after witness was called, and it became very clear, very fast, that Eichmann was not following orders, that he was trying to do the best job he possibly could and kill the most Jews the most efficiently in the least amount of time, and there was more than enough evidence to support this. And Adolf Eichmann, well, before I explain what happened in the end, I'll explain what happened during the trial. This trial was broadcast on television in America and on radio. We didn't have TV in Israel yet, on the radio in Israel. And what happened was it was very compelling, must-see TV, so to speak. And you had people huddling around radios in Israel, huddling around televisions in America. And what happened was, it wasn't just that Eichmann was on trial. Essentially, the entire Holocaust goes on trial. And witness after witness, they're talking about Eichmann, but they're really talking about all kinds of things that happened in the Holocaust. And for the first time, what you had was children hearing what happened in the Holocaust, really for the first time, from Holocaust survivors, looking at their parents and saying, "Wait a minute, is this what happened to you? Like, I didn't," or your teacher or your neighbor or whoever you might be, all of a sudden in Israel, people are looking at the Holocaust survivor that are listening to the radio next to them, not realizing that they never really knew what happened in the Holocaust. And they looked at the Holocaust survivor, the person next to them, listening to the radio, and they said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, is that what happened to you? Can you please tell it what happened? What's your story?" And all of a sudden, all across the world, especially in Israel and America, the Eichmann trial and the fact that the Holocaust goes on trial is going to finally have essentially people welcome Holocaust survivors to open up, and they're at this point begging to hear their stories. And finally, you're talking about 15, 16 years after the Holocaust is over, the Holocaust survivors are finally able to tell their story to people that are ready and willing to listen and know how to respond. And finally, the wounds that had been festering by keeping all this inside, and the difficult relationships with friends and neighbors and parents and children, finally these wounds begin to heal in 1961 because of the Eichmann trial. Adolf Eichmann was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was eventually executed. He was hung. his ashes were scattered out of Israel's waters in the Mediterranean Sea, so nobody can ever visit his grave or pay their respects. There's no grave for Adolf Eichmann anywhere. But I think it's worth talking about two things that he said in his life before he died. And that's how we'll end. One of the things he said was that he would jump into his grave laughing, knowing that he took 6 million, or I think he didn't, I don't think he said 6 million, but that he took millions of Jews before anybody got to him. And this was a man who really reveled in the idea that he murdered this many people. And at one point, he also said the following. He said to one of his guards, someone while he was in prison, he said, "You guys think you won, but you didn't win. You think it's over, but it's not over. Because we destroyed, you guys are like a chicken without a head." What's he talking about? What does that mean? Basically, in the Holocaust, they destroyed the Jews of Poland completely. At the time, the biggest and richest Jewish community in the world, one of the richest Jewish communities ever. And it was completely destroyed. 90% of Polish Jews were killed in the Holocaust. He said, "You Jews are like a chicken without a head." And what does that mean? It means basically that you can run around for a little while, but eventually you're going to fall over and die. It's like a tree whose roots are poisoned, right? That tree will stay standing for a little while, but eventually that poison will seep in and that tree will wither and die. How do we respond to this? So, look, I just spoke with my students a couple days ago. I was Zooming with them. I did share screen and I Googled the term Holohoax. An infinite Holocaust denial website images came up. And one of the ways we respond to this is by dealing more forcefully or dealing with it all, the unfortunately relatively large movement of Holocaust denial. It's unbelievable what's going on the internet in terms of Holocaust denial. And of course, not only on the internet, but that's where it lives. But I would say when it comes to responding to that idea, I mean, the sad part, I don't know if anybody saw, but an article just came out 2 days ago, from Times of Israel, that said, it gave a census of the Jewish people that were up to, I forget the exact numbers, and I don't want to bring it up right now to forget the technical glitches, but it said we're up to like 15 million Jews in the world. Something like that, it said. And then the headline, the sub-headline was, "Still far less than existed in World War II." So unfortunately, the sad reality of what Eichmann said, the idea that we're like a people with a chicken without a head that's going to eventually fall over and die, is, I always say to my students when I talk about this, that like, unfortunately, I think the jury to a certain extent is still out on this, at least outside of Israel. The jury's still out. And what do I mean by that? I mean, there were around 18 million Jews in the world before the Holocaust. There were around 12 million Jews in the world after the Holocaust. And now we're 70 years later, and our 12 million Jews have grown to, we can look up the article, it's like 15. That's not normal population growth numbers over 70 some years. We're supposed to be growing a hell of a lot faster than that. And why aren't we? We all know the various issues with Jewish population growth, and people could talk about things like, you know, assimilation, people could talk about things like intermarriage and things, all these things that we hear about of the reasons why the Jewish people, but I want to quote one of my colleagues, Reuven, who says those are not the reasons, those are just symptoms. Those are not the problem. The problem isn't assimilation. That's a symptom of the problem. The problem is that not enough Jews care about being Jewish. And if you don't care about being Jewish, then you might do things like assimilate another, right? And let's not talk about the symptoms, let's talk about the real problem. And one of the things that was lost in that Polish Jewish community, when we go to Poland, we learn that it was a rich community where everyone, whether you were any kind of Jew you were, secular, religious, anything in the middle, communist, socialist, whatever you were a strong, passionate Jew. We cannot say the same, unfortunately, about the Jewish world today. That every Jew, no matter how religious, secular, whatever your ideologies, wherever you live, is a strong, passionate Jew. That's simply not the case, unfortunately. Look, I really don't believe, I always tell my students this, and I really mean it, that I think it's not good if people's, I mean, a poll came out a couple of years ago. I think it was a Pew poll. It's a big, very, 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 very well-known thing. Talked about like the most important aspects of Judaism for American Jews. And I believe that number one, if I'm not mistaken, was remembering the Holocaust. Number two was like Jewish humor. Somewhere down the line were things like actual aspects of Judaism, which was kind of disappointing to me, because I don't think that Jewish humor is the number two thing about Judaism, in my opinion, even though it is great. And I certainly don't think the number one most important aspect of someone's Jewish identity should be the Holocaust. It is for some people. I don't think it should be number one. But I would be lying, of course, and I think we'd all be lying if we'd say it's not a strong part of us. It is part of our Jewish identity. It needs to be part of it. One of the founders of our school, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, his name is Baruch Strauss, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, used to tell Baruch the following story, we ended up inheriting it from him. That essentially his father, they were hiding, he and his brothers in the forest, in a hideout. Eventually the Nazis found them. They had to run into the woods. He quickly looked, it's the middle of the winter, he quickly looked to his side, and he saw his boots and his tefillin standing on the side, and in a split-second decision, he grabbed his tefillin and ran into the cold forest in the winter with no boots. And he got frostbite, of course, and lost feeling in his toes, and he lost toes, and he limped for the rest of his life, Baruch's father. And he used to tell Baruch that I walk with a limp because of that decision. I don't regret it for a minute. And I'm gonna limp to every single bar mitzvah and every single brit milah and every single Jewish wedding that I can possibly get to. And I'm gonna dance my face off and I'm gonna celebrate like crazy, because every time we do one of those things, we are putting another nail in Hitler's coffin. And while I don't believe that showing the Nazis they were wrong should be the number one reason to be Jewish, I definitely think it should be somewhere on the list. And I think when we have an evil Nazi telling us that we're a poison tree whose roots are poisoned and eventually is going to fall over and die, I think the major response is whatever we do that's Jewish, whatever it is, like Baruch's father said, is another nail in Hitler's coffin. Whether it's coming to Israel, whether it's sending your kids on this program, whether it's going to shul, whether it's giving tzedakah, whether it's reading the Israeli news, whether it's whatever Jewish thing you do, all of those things are, to quote Baruch's father, another nail in Hitler's coffin. And I would say that I think the Jewish people has the potential to be a really, I wouldn't argue actually with the quote. I actually think that they did poison our roots, the Nazis. But I think we're a really special kind of tree. And I think that we can show against the odds that we, despite the fact that those roots did get poisoned, the Holocaust did happen, a third of the Jews in the world did get killed, we can still regrow those roots and be just as strong one day as we once were. But that's all of our responsibilities. It's all of our jobs. We have to actually get out and do Judaism to make that happen and not allow that quote to really come to fruition the way the Nazis thought it would. And that's our job. That's our responsibility. So I want to thank everyone for listening. I'm going to end with that. Greg, if you want to take questions.
Yeah, Danny, thank you so much. We have some time for a couple of questions. It looks like you can, I'm going to open up the chat to everybody so everyone can see the questions, everyone publicly. So go ahead, if you have questions, feel free to chat them out. We have time for one or two.
Are you going to read them, Greg, or should I read them?
I mean, I'm happy to read them when they pop up. If somebody wants to raise their hand, or even, you know what, maybe I can, well, you can type them in. Are there any questions? Yes. Any questions? Somebody wrote something about the heroism of the Bricha movement, which I don't know about.
Right, which is helping Jews. So it's a different subject. Something I mean, we could talk about, but helping Holocaust survivors escape the DP camps, basically cross various borders in Europe, hike over mountains in many cases. These Holocaust survivors get on boats and get to Israel. That is one of the most incredible stories. I mean, I think that one of the most amazing stories in all of Judaism is, and I think we all feel it, is the phoenix, that out of the ashes of the Holocaust arose the Jewish state. And certainly I'm not someone who thinks that the reason Israel exists is because of the Holocaust. In fact, the Jewish people were here having a strong state by 1939, and Israel was going to exist anyway. But certainly the timing has to do with the Holocaust, absolutely, in 1948. And that story of the Bricha is an unbelievable, incredible movement after the Holocaust. And I think that the idea that Holocaust survivors basically are going to risk everything. I mean, they didn't have a whole lot to risk, but despite that, you're talking about people who were only a few weeks earlier, or a few months earlier, I guess I should say, completely emaciated, hiking over mountain passes with no hiking boots and no North Face fleece, and getting on horrific boats and risking going to British prisons, which is where they were put, by the way, when they were caught. And most of them were caught, by the way. It's an unbelievable example of Jewish heroism after the Holocaust, no doubt.
Thank you. We have time for one more. I think if you type it in, or to the host or to everybody, unless there are no questions.
I'll just say on that note, by the way, it's always great, especially in these times when we're stuck at home, to find something really good and meaningful to watch, or to watch in this case, because we're all stuck at home, for Yom HaShoah. So I don't know if it's easy to get, but there's a documentary came out in 1997 called The Long Way Home, which is essentially that story, the story of the Jews from liberation to arriving, and I think it might end with even Israel being declared. It's original footage. It's unbelievably powerful. It's unbelievably meaningful. It's an incredible documentary. If anybody can find that and watch that today or ever, I highly, highly recommend it. But it tells a lot about that story, and it's really, 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 really unbelievable.
Danny, can I ask a historical question? Maybe you know the answer to. So we had cousins who were presidents or chairs of the Philadelphia Survivors Association for a while. And I remember speaking to them when they were alive, that survivors associations in Jewish communities were relatively newish. I wonder if that was a post Eichmann trial phenomena here in the States. I don't know if it existed around the world, or that was just something that happened here in the States, where survivors felt comfortable enough coming out to tell their stories, and then would gather together and then speak publicly.
Right. So I actually don't know. It sounds like that's exactly the kind of thing that sprung up after the Eichmann trial. I don't know specifically, though, about those organizations. I don't know the answer. I'm sorry.
Okay. Any other questions? So before we close out, I'll give Danny the last word. I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us once again today. If you have not already emailed me, please email me at glitkovsky, Litcof, as in Frank, SKY, at MHSI.org to let us know that you were here and how you heard about us, so that we can make sure that we are publicizing our classes every day at 1 o'clock. Remember, every day at 1 o'clock, the same Zoom call. Join us tomorrow Monday through Thursday. Different must teachers will be different topics. We have now scheduled through the end of April, and we'll be scheduling through the end of May. So please join us, not just for today, but also each and every day. Danny, thank you very much. The last word is yours.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate everybody and seeing everybody being here. Look, it's Yom HaShoah now for the next 24 hours. And I think it's really, now that we're stuck at home with not a whole lot to do, I think it's a great opportunity to really do a deep dive into aspects of the Shoah that maybe you guys don't know about. Find something to watch. Find something on YouTube, like I said before. There's an unbelievable, absolutely incredible 9-hour documentary. So you probably won't get through all of it this Yom HaShoah, but I highly recommend it. It's called Shoah by Cloud Landsman. And he interviewed Holocaust survivors and Nazis, by the way, with hidden cameras across the world over 10 years, and put it all together. It's incredible. Watch that. Watch The Long Way Home. Log on, and in Israel, there's going to be we have something called Zikaron Basalon, where Holocaust survivors open up their living rooms or get hosted in someone else's living room and tell their story. Now it's going to be virtual, but spend this Yom HaShoah really going deeply into it, because a lot of us are stuck at home with nothing better to do. And I think it's a really great opportunity actually to really use this Yom HaShoah and do something meaningful. So thank you
Thank
guys
you.
so much. I really appreciate seeing everybody.
Thank you again, Danny. And the last thing I will add is that tomorrow morning, speaking of Yom HaShoah, at 9:30 a.m., there is a special assembly being run by the State of Israel that is usually run in person, obviously, but is being run by the Israeli government online. And if you're interested in finding out more information, you can visit our social media, Facebook, or follow us on Instagram, and all the information for the online Yom HaShoah memorial tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, being hosted by the President of Israel, is now online. So you can visit our social media pages, our Facebook account, and our Instagram account. Make sure you follow us, and you can find out more information about that. Danny, thank you as always.
Thank you guys. Have a meaningful day.